Let's jump right in so we can make the most of our time together. My name is Jenny Cotting. I'm a communications consultant working with ODE. I also currently work as communications director for the Partnership for the Future of Learning. That's a national network that supports public education through an anti-racist lens using narrative and policy change. I just wanted to introduce myself before we jumped into the slide deck, so I'll do that now. And welcome you all. Thank you so much for being here. Really, it was good to share space together today. So I'm here to facilitate your process of preparing for challenging conversations and offering a chance to practice, making space for what you know, making space for some dialogue. And I know that you all are very practiced already at challenging conversations. This may in some ways affirm what you already do. And it's also going to be a way to coach people who are going to be seeing this recording. So you're kind of helping me with the performance of the recording and the training as well. And it's good to be in community together, knowing that you're sharing some similar experience. So hopefully we can make the most of that today. I want you to know that I've also developed approaches for having heart-to-heart conversations on controversial issues, the kinds of issues that go deep into our values and identities. And this training is geared towards having challenging conversations in districts with parents, staff, students, and I'm also drawing lessons from deep canvassing. Some of the good research that we have about challenging conversations, about what's proven to shift people even a little bit, comes from deep canvassing. All right, but I did want to start off with a note of love, something to consider as we take on something that can feel kind of difficult. For person-to-person conversations, love is something that helps us out, care is something that helps us out when talking points don't quite get us where we want to go. So human connection is what the approach for today is going to be, and making sure that our talking points hold some of that as well. But I just wanted to acknowledge that these are some of the hardest conversations that we can have. They can really affect us. We can feel at risk of being unable to shift someone else. Can everybody mute, please? We can feel at risk of shifting away from where our moral compass guides us. And we also know that it's very clear that there are a lot of people out there who are dedicated to the extreme misinformation that fuels a prejudiced stance. So some challenging conversations can feel hopeless. And people tend to reject arguments that don't already fit into their worldview, no matter how clever or well-formed or researched those arguments or talking points are. And we still have to have those conversations, right? So let's talk about it today. And I just wanted to start with my story. I'm going to be asking you to share some of your stories today. So I thought it would only be fair, and also wanted to set the tone a little bit because this is a story that does make me feel a little vulnerable to tell it. But I've been thinking about it a lot these days in particular. So I used to be the argumentative, white, fairly conservative person that you may or may not end up talking to in a challenging conversation. When I was young, I was deeply conservative. I went to an all-white church. I went to an all-white private Calvinist Christian school. I chose to go there myself. And I'd like to believe that I wasn't racist, but I was, certainly. And I might have remained so if I didn't have access to 12 years of higher education. I spent a year studying critical race theory, and I got the words I needed to say in a pretty package. So we know not everybody has that, right? And plus, I had a mom who was a public school psychology and world history teacher. And even though she was conservative at the time too, she taught me that I could diverge from the crowd, that people who were different from me could change me in a good way, and that there wasn't something to fear in that. So I know from my own childhood communities of white people of faith that the people who remained in that community were really fearful of moving outside of it, outside of the fellowship that they found there, the deep safety that they found in their community. And that has made them, and I've seen them, this happen to people that I would have called my friends, just be very vulnerable to the views of vocal white supremacists. And it's gotten to the point where now they're living in a different reality and it's very hard to communicate with them. So I've seen that to move them, I have to see them as people who are suffering as well under the oppression of white supremacy, and that being in relationship with them is something that can help kind of get through and get there. So I still love them deeply, and I desperately want them to come with me towards loving people who are not in their own small white community. All right, so here's what we're doing today. We're going to find the opportunity and the challenge of these conversations, talk about some tactics for setting up how a good conversation can go, starting the conversation by hearing their perspective, getting into the flow of the conversation, how to be direct and kind. We'll spend a good deal of time talking about some relevant talking points, how to end a conversation when you need to, in the way that you need to, and then save a good 10 minutes at the end for hearing from you about what tactics have worked for you. Like I said, you're all experts in this already, so I'm really hoping to bring your wisdom into this as well. All right, so even though some of these conversations can feel daunting, I think that it's good to ground ourselves in the purpose of having these conversations. And the first for me is that living one's values, or being a leader, is rarely both easy and meaningful at the same time. It could be very easy and not very impactful and not result in change, or it can be difficult and risky and have a serious opportunity to bring about change. And we know that, maybe you know this from your relationships as well, a lesson I learned in life is that trust is not always built through constant agreement, that you can have an honest disagreement with someone, arrive at a deeper understanding through dialogue, and build stronger relationships that way, staying in relationships with people you may disagree with to an extent. And that might give you a stronger relationship than someone you tacitly agree with but never go deeper with. You can earn respect and trust even if you remain in disagreement. And you can't likely cause a 180-degree turn in perspective in someone's mind, but you can plant a seed or start a relationship, and you can provide information and clarity as well. All right, so we're on that slide 4. Unfortunately, I already have 2 volunteers. I'm going to ask you to share your stories after this slide. And I wanted to get you also some good information about how to prepare your mind and heart. So if you imagine, like, if you've had a stressful day, a really stressful day, and you go home, or you go into the next room after your Zoom call, and you go into a conversation with your loved one and you realize too late that you brought your stress level with you, or if you've accidentally gotten into an argument, maybe on Facebook, and you left feeling really drained or upset unexpectedly, sometimes that's because preparation didn't go into it, and your heart and your mind weren't quite ready, and you weren't transitioning. So it's really worth taking care of yourself and taking care of the person you're talking to by having some cushion around difficult conversations that you know are going to be difficult. And I just wanted to talk about the race, like our race, our ethnicity, our way of showing up in the world as well, in having these challenging conversations, especially when the conversations are about race. For white people, I think that at this time, it's really important that we hold space for challenging conversations about race as best we can. And even doing that, though, I know can feel far away from your moral compass to even give space to abhorrent views or racist paradigms, and we have to do it anyway. And a note for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, people of color in position requiring these conversations where you are also risking parts of yourselves. This kind of preparation can be helpful to take care of yourself, decide on your boundaries in advance, set a plan, build in some community care, that kind of thing. So the first question everybody can ask in order to do that, ask yourself what you need. You're not just in service to these conversations, your needs count. What ground rules can you set up in advance at the beginning of the conversation to make sure that you do have what you need? So that might be something as simple as, I'm looking forward to having a constructive conversation with you. And then it can be kind of triggering or uncomfortable or feel like really hard work to engage in these conversations. So I do want to take us on that journey of getting to the point where we know how to end the conversation, because sometimes if you're getting in that point where it's neither productive and you're being harmed, then it's good to have that line ready to say, Thank you for having this conversation with me. I'm going to end the conversation now. I will follow up with you afterwards. So we'll talk about some of these other items in the next coming slides, but I wanted to pause and ask James, would you please share a story about a difficult conversation that you have had that's resulted in a closer relationship or surprised you in some way? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. Back in 2008, 2009, the Oregon economy kind of took a turn for the worst. And I was principal at San Barlow High School at that time. Majority of the staff, I think 97% of our staff at that point in time were white. And we ended up having to cut about 10 full-time equivalent teachers. And it was my 4th year as principal of the school, going into my 5th year. And I remember some of the decisions from the district office about reducing the numbers of teachers in the building. And at the time, we were told as principals that we were going to be the ones who had the conversations with our staff. And so in preparing for those challenging and difficult conversations, it was really important for me to make sure that the staff felt listened to. I was really giving them some very unfortunate news that would affect their ability to support themselves and their families, as well as some of the challenges that were ahead of the district and in the state over the next several years. And I can remember each of those 10 conversations very well, because it almost left me in tears having to say to somebody that while we've appreciated the work that you've done in the building for the last 2, 3 to 5 years, we were looking at reducing our staff to the point where for some of our staff, it was a very challenging circumstance. And so, you know, I tried to connect with them as far as making sure I listened. I was empathetic. I certainly, some of them were not very happy, and they thought that the decision could be changed or could be different. But at the end of each of the conversations, I tried making sure that what do you need from me at this point in time? And for some of them, it was, I don't need anything. I don't think there's anything that you can do. Or some of them said, you know, I would really appreciate a letter of recommendation or anything you can do to reach out to other districts in the region. Or if I need, you know, a letter of support, I would love to have that. So I think it changed me as an educator and as a leader in the manner in which I engage in conversations with people. While that was a challenging conversation, I realized that um, that I have the ability to really lean in and support people in very challenging times. And, you know, many years later, I take that to heart, and I continue to try to do that, because while I have not been on that side of the equation, I do know that in those really challenging circumstances, it's important to be a human being and being one that can really provide that support. And even, you know, years later, we did have the ability to rehire some of those staff members back, and I've heard that they've appreciated, you know, that collegiality, that support, and just, you know, having an ear and listening to them.
Thank you for that, James. That was a very meaningful story. Corinne, would you be willing to share yours as well?
Thanks, James, for sharing that. It resonates with me greatly. I have a similar, well, difficult conversation that I had to have with a community member regarding a Latino family night that I wanted to hold completely in Espanol. And it was my first year as a principal, and it was my colleague and I, my associate principal and I were the first Latinas leading at the secondary level in this district. So we were really excited to support our Latino community. And this was a middle school where 75% of the students were of color. So that's a pretty large number of students, right? They're no longer considered the minority. There had never been a Latino family night that was all in Espanol. So we had publicized this because in our regular family nights with our PTA, It was predominantly white middle-class families and all in English, and it did not represent the 75% of the students and families that were part of our school system. So my associate principal and I worked together to create this amazing event. And we made sure we were clear that it was not just for Latino families, that we would welcome any family and we would translate for them. So the primary language would be Espanol, and any translations that anyone else needed, they would have the headsets and we would have people helping support with the language. So I got a phone call from a very angry community member, a community member that didn't even have children at my school, and basically said that I needed to go back to Mexico. I was never born in Mexico. I was born in the United States, and that we were not to be speaking Mexican anymore in the US, that we needed to speak English. And I didn't know what to do at that point because I was overwhelmed with kind of some fear and started to get all tingly and my heart started pumping out of my chest. And so I did what mi abuelo told me to do, is take a deep breath and lean in, because critical conversations are really important. And in my culture, in my experience, I was always taught to not run away from conflict, to lean in and have that dialogue. And I don't consider it courageous, because that was just part of who I was growing up. But I'd never really done that as a principal professionally. It was such a controversial issue. So I leaned in and I said, the night is a family night for all families. It is a Latino family night where there'll be Espanol. It'll be the first language. However, if you would like to attend, I about thought, oh crap, do I really want to invite this person to attend with my families after he just called me Mexican, go back to Mexico and stop speaking Mexican in the US. And so the person paused for a moment and said, well, why would I want to come to that? I don't even have students there. I said, well, that's exactly right. You should come so you could see what happens within the school that's in your community, and see the children that run around your neighborhoods and who makes up, right, our community and our neighborhoods. So the gentleman said, all right, I'll come. And I thought, okay, so maybe I need to prep a little bit and prep him. And so I had him his own little translator. They came and he engaged with his neighbors, and it was a wonderful and scary experience all the time. But I knew in my heart that my Latino families would welcome him with joy and food and celebration, that the ignorance would completely, and shouldn't call it ignorance, the unknown, because it was unknown to him, would shift because of the warm welcome he would receive. And that's exactly what happened. He was really full. I mean, he probably had to undo his pants as he left, because he had a ton of tamales and food at this event, and he had a deeper appreciation of his neighbors. And I felt safer in having those difficult conversations later.
Incredible. Well, that story is a really wonderful segue into my next slide, but I just wanted to thank you both again for sharing so deeply, because these stories are both important and there are a lot of lessons that we can draw from. Oh, we have one more person who might want to share. Okay, so I can only see your username, but I would love for you to share, if you could share quickly, GELMANC. That I can only see the username, but can you unmute yourself and share?
Hi, I just, I was just telling you if you needed an extra one. I know a lot of people have stories, so.
I'd love to hear your story.
Okay, so last year we had a situation that happened with Park Rose on the basketball team. And the students on the basketball team were called racial slurs and all of that when they played another high school. So we were going to play that high school. So that happened on a Tuesday. We were going to play them on Friday. And so my AD called and said, oh, the girls wanted to wear t-shirts to the game. And I told them no. They wanted to wear t-shirts that say Park Rose Strong. And it was just to show that support for Park Rose and what they had experienced, which was pretty traumatic. So I asked my AD, well, why did they want to wear them? Did you talk to them? Did you have a conversation with them? And he said, no. and he was new. And I said, well, I always ask the kids, like, why do you want to do something? And I want to hear kind of their story because, you know, I'm a high school principal, but sometimes our kids fight. They need to learn how to use their words sometimes in a different way to be empowered. So I said, I always have kids, like, I want them to fight in a way that, like, where they're advocating, not with their fists, right? So I went to the team and I said, why do you want to do this? And I had this really deep, meaningful conversation with the girls. And so I decided to let them wear the t-shirts. And when I got back to my own admin team, they were really upset with me. I mean, they were just like, oh my God, this is crazy. Why would you do that? It's so disrespectful. And da, 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 da. And I questioned them and I said, oh, was Martin Luther King disrespectful? You know, I started asking them questions, you know, was it disrespectful to sit on the front of the bus? Was it, you know, and I said, so, you know, when our kids want to make a difference and do something, we need to help them and support them and help them navigate that and empower them. And I said, I got this, don't worry, right? So my team is falling apart. And in the end, so I call, and then a mom comes in and she says, I don't want my girl wearing that shirt. And she's a mother, a white mom. And I said, I understand how you feel. I said, I didn't realize what she wanted me to know was that the girls on the other basketball team were really upset and they were embarrassed and that they don't feel that way. And so she was worried about their well-being. And I said, thank you so much for coming in and sharing that with me. I said, I'm still going to let the girls wear the t-shirts, but what I'll do is I'm going to reach out to the principal and talk to the principal about this, which I was going to do anyway, because I think it's appropriate with our colleagues. So I called the principal and the principal was awesome. And we talked about it and I said, I've got these t-shirts and I don't want you to get blindsided. And so basically, long story short, we brought enough t-shirts for both of the teams because I shared with the principal, like, here's what I'm hearing about how your girls are feeling, right? And she did a great job of presenting to the staff about the situation that took place and it isn't going to be tolerated. So we brought enough t-shirts for both sides and both sides wore the t-shirts and the principal did a wonderful speech at the beginning talking about that we're not going to tolerate racist language and things like that. And it actually turned out really powerful. And then my team came back and they were like, oh my God, that was the best thing ever. Like, how could we have had a better outcome than that? And so my thing was just like, you guys just trusted me. Like, I've been doing this for a long time. Like, we can't let fear prevent us from doing the right thing. And we can't let fear prevent us from trying to be creative and, you know, still going through and following through with love. We can do this with love and we can do this and just be really like firm in our work. And it turned out great. And the girls were empowered and Park Rose was very thankful. So it was a good outcome.
Thank you. Carmen, right? Carmen Urbina shared your name. Thank you so much. So this is kind of meta because the whole point of this presentation is that sharing stories is a powerful way to convey information and help shift people. And so by virtue of you all sharing, you're teaching the lessons that I'm supposed to be teaching without me having to. So this is worth making space for. And there's going to be more space coming up for one more story and then time to talk at the end as well. So we'll keep going. All right. I just wanted to share some ways of setting goals for how to move people really quick. You're not maybe always going to have the chance to do the most powerful movement work that we've just heard about in a way that moves people from like disgust to affirmation at an event, right? Or from discomfort to activism, like in the last story. But if you kind of think through this and set a realistic goal, you might know that if a parent comes in and they are telling you, I'm not a white supremacist, but I don't think a teacher should be wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt on a Zoom call, it makes me uncomfortable, where might you take them from there? Could it be that you share a story that gets them to a place that's a little bit different from that? And so this is also worth considering, though, if somebody comes in from a place of support, right? Or you're having a conversation with somebody who affirms the decisions that you've made. Can you move them to a place of activism where they will be a vocal supporter? Because we know that people are going to vocally disagree. So can we build a base of people that are going to be vocally supporting as well? All right, so some ways of starting the conversation, like once you're in it, once you're there, definitely with those boundaries, setting a time, a tone, and a purpose, particularly if you're really worried, is a good place to start. So you can define those things early on. Um, I think some of the strongest points of the stories I just heard as well were around like wanting to bring people together, wanting to get to know them, wanting them to feel a sense of belonging too, not just to convince them of an argument. So finding a way to say, like, I want to know you better. I want to know your story. I want to meet you. I want to meet with you. All of this is a powerful way of getting people feeling comfortable. And then if they're being abrasive or if they're really pushing you with their story around a reason that they want you to change something that you're not willing to do or change, sometimes asking clarifying questions can get you really far. So help me understand better why you're saying X, Y, or Z. And please tell me more about your safety concerns. What do you fear is going to happen here? And then finally, using tone and nonverbal cues to your advantage. A lot of people know and say that when you leave a conversation, it's very hard to remember the words that you said and the things that you said. People will remember your tone. They'll remember that, they'll take it away with them as a feeling, right? So that was also a powerful thing, I think, in the stories we just heard as well. Actually, I did want to pause again and just see if one or two people might have like another tactic very quickly, like at the start of a conversation, if you're having a tough conversation, what do you do at the very beginning to see if you can set it up for success? I'll just pause for a moment to see if anybody has an idea that's right on the tip of their tongue.
I can offer one, Jenny, and it comes from my work and my research, and it's a mantra that I've held for a long time, and it's regulate before you communicate. And I think that when we're faced with difficult conversations, and these conversations tend to be difficult, one of the things that happens is we get physiologically aroused, and we may not recognize it. So our heart rate goes up, we start feeling flush, our blood pressure goes up. As Carmen would say, you feel a rush of cortisol. And there's a lot of really good research that shows from John Gottman's lab at the University of Washington that when your heart rate is above a certain threshold, and so for most of us, that's about 120 beats per minute, it literally leads us to have a cognitive shutdown. So we're no longer able to access the regions of our brains, and in this case, the frontal parts of our brains that allow us to step back, be mindful, communicate effectively. And so when we're physiologically aroused and we feel all of that arousal happening, from a biological perspective, it's extremely difficult for us to pull back and get that space. So the other piece of the equation is that when you lengthen your exhalation, that helps to down-regulate that stress response and up-regulate the relaxation response. And so when I know I'm walking into a situation, or when I find myself getting really worked up during a difficult conversation, I really focus hard to lengthen my exhale and just try to bring my physiology down, because I know in the absence of that, I might be marginally effective, but that I only have a small amount of my mental resources to work with. So that's my number one go-to strategy.
Thank you so much, Grace. That's super helpful, and it reminded me of what Corinne said. The first thing that Corinne did on that phone call was to take a big, deep breath, right? So that's really, really great. And so these are all kind of fitting together into some more advice that I think is pretty familiar to folks about being direct and kind, persuading rather than always trying to use data, focusing on storytelling, and really getting personal rather than generalizing. And one of the things that you might see come across your desk in the form from ODE or from other places when you have these conversations, or when something big is happening, is you might receive a bunch of talking points. How do you make those personal rather than general? I want to practice that with you really quick. And I'm hoping that someone can both practice their tone of voice and practice reading this general talking point for me. And then they will read the next one, which is a personalized version. Is someone willing to unmute and do that?
I will.
Thank you.
Black Lives Matter means that a Black person's life or a Black student's life is just as valuable as anyone else's life. And Black students need to know they matter in our classrooms just like all other students. All students belong.
That was a powerful reading. Next one, same person.
I've had conversations with people who have lots of different perspectives. When I've talked to people who wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts, they want Black students to know they matter in our classrooms, just like all other students. They want to make sure all students belong.
Thank you so much. So when you're seeing the difference between the first one and the second one, it's not too hard to make that step, and you can talk about your conversations with other people. You can talk about your own feelings and what you've observed in life, but this is the kind of logic that we're going to be applying in the coming slides when we're going to be practicing some relevant talking points. Along the way, I want you to continue thinking about what your stories are and what you can bring to the table, so that when you do enter these conversations, you'll feel like you have done some preparation work as part of this training. But I'm going to keep going so that we can have some time together at the end as well. So that last reading was very powerful from Cynthia, and I want another person to do that here with this slide. This is just when somebody just needs information from you. How can you deliver the information with some personalization or with your tone of voice in a way that will help them get there? Would somebody be willing to unmute and read these?
Yeah, sure, I will. The policy came about because students asked for the state to prohibit 3 hate symbols in schools and establish procedures for addressing bias incidents. I think the policy is important because of what I've seen happening. My goal is to get to the underlying roots that drive students to use hate speech and symbols. We can have conversations like this one. We can make sure our curriculum speaks to the history of different symbols, including the history of Black Lives Matter as a declaration that's always been about increasing understanding, tolerance, and love, not hate. Oh, do you want me to?
You don't have to tell a story. The ... and the suggestion here are like where you can take this next, right, to continue the conversation. So in the first one, and thank you so much for that reading, Kimmy, it was perfect. You might say, here's what I've seen happening, right, and tell your story there. Or say, you know, here's what a teacher that I've seen in this school does in order to make this conversation happen. So those are some examples. So when you want to talk about Black Lives Matter, we know that you're taking potentially a risk if you're speaking with someone who is very aggressively against the topic, for example. So I think that sometimes you want to practice what it means to be firm about talking about your position and how decisions are made while talking about Black Lives Matter. And just a heads up, the reason that we're talking about Black Lives Matter especially is not only that it serves as a powerful example here, but that's what's coming up right now for a lot of folks who are in these positions. So practicing this is helpful in that way. And I am looking for another volunteer to read these.
I'm happy to, Jenny. As a principal or superintendent, it's my responsibility to make sure that all of our students are safe and welcome, and to be intentional about making sure that our most historically marginalized students, Black and Brown students, are being fully supported. Number 2, sure. In our school and district, we use an equity lens as a guide for all of our decisions, and we encourage thoughtful debate when disagreements arise. We've seen Black Lives Matter enter into conversations in our schools as a statement about justice, which aligns with our commitment to authentically affirm the identities of students, families, and staff.
Perfect, thank you so much. And this is an open door then to say, this means our students are able to do this thing that you can say something special is happening, or data that you know about your school or district or that kind of thing as well. So, and To continue to go a little bit deeper, maybe you have to respond to a very specific scenario. And we heard some great stories about this earlier as well. But how do you kind of talk directly about it without going to the bigger picture right away and really address what's happening? So would somebody else be willing to read these two examples of how you might do that?
I'm happy to do that. A classroom educator wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt is showing Black students that they are safe and have an adult that they can talk to if they are bullied. Educators in our school district are doing amazing work to make sure all students feel welcome. And I imagine a story goes there. While Black Lives Matter may be controversial for some members of the community, it is not associated with a specific candidate or political campaign. It is not a violation of state policy for staff or students to have BLM branded items such as clothing or email signatures.
Thank you so much, Samantha. So this is another opportunity to talk about what teachers are doing to make all students feel welcome, to do special events like the ones we heard about earlier. And also, you might want to refer to an existing policy. And not all schools have the same policy, I know, so you would want to cater it to your own. And of course, you know, you'd modify the language here to fit how you talk about teachers or how you talk about students, right? And what makes sense for the folks in your district. So let's dig into this idea of the symbols of hate versus symbols of love a little bit, because this may come up a little bit as well in symbols other than Black Lives Matter. I've heard like hammer and sickle as one. There may be other like flags that are one. And so let's hear these in the context of Black Lives Matter, but also thinking maybe more broadly as well. And these are going to be like from your personal perspective. So let's give it a personal touch. Can somebody else jump in?
I can go. I don't know if you could, can you hear me? Is my mic working?
Yes, go for it.
Perfect. Okay, sorry. In my time as a superintendent principal, I've seen a big difference between symbols that promote hate and symbols that promote love and tolerance. I hear directly from students that they don't want to be excluded, feel less than other kids, or be bullied. Then a story, which I have a lot of. I've been asking myself a lot, what side of history will our district or school end up on? Are we going to say, yes, we affirm the dignity and humanity of Black people when it's been the opposite for centuries? The decisions that are coming up right now are never easy, but I believe.
Thank you so much. Did you want to share one of your stories?
Well, I kind of do just a little, because it was a gender one, and it kind of goes to how we handle starting that topic. And we had a really hot one here a couple years ago when our Gay Straight Alliance wanted to put on a talent show. And it was kind of the same idea. A number of our phone calls and things that were coming in were not from parents of students, but from community members who were very upset. And I just got to the point where I wouldn't have a phone conversation or email. Everything was an invite. I didn't have the secretary call and invite people in. I was stalking them on Facebook and through county property records to find out where they lived if they wouldn't come, so that I could offer to come to their home and meet with them if they wanted to. But I just felt like it was such a charged issue, and it was so personal to people that it really deserved a personal conversation of why I believed it was the right thing to do for our students, and I believed that they had a story that they needed to share, but it wouldn't work through email, and it was too easy for them to, I don't want to say hide behind the phone in that, but they could be mean on the phone, where it was harder when you see the person you're talking to hopefully it was harder to be as mean, and it was easier to disarm. So that was just kind of the part that I wanted to share, back to that idea of ways to enter into the conversation.
That's so important. And it especially is important to think about that now when so many of us have to be virtual or can't necessarily be in person in close contact, right? So that makes these conversations harder if that can't happen. So I really appreciate that. I also wanted to mention, going a little bit on the last slide, but in general, there are a couple of things that if you're talking to folks who do embrace white supremacy or other related sort of political viewpoints, or if they're very strongly stating things like Blue Lives Matter or making their own points that seem to be in contradiction to yours, you might want to avoid these things. So you can certainly say that Black Lives Matter is not political, but I'm worried that people might not buy it just because there's so many protests happening. The message you're trying to get across there is that even with a lot of political turmoil going on, that Black Lives Matter isn't supporting a political figure or a party, that it's not partisan, and that's what means that it's not breaking the policy, right? So, but if you try to make a broader point about it being political or not, they may or may not buy into that. And they may get sort of aggressive, making an argument about how they see it as political. So just be prepared for that. And then it's okay to say justice, but heads up, if you say social justice to a person of that mindset, they may immediately go into this idea that you are quote unquote a social justice warrior, which is kind of code for their enemy or opponent in their views. So just be cautious around some of these languages, pieces of language that are kind of overdetermined or have taken on these bigger meanings than what we would like to have happen. All right, so ending the conversation, I think that there are lots and lots of things that you can say, and I do think that sometimes you're going to be in a place where you're stating a decision that's already been made, whether by you or by others, and how do you end the conversation with gratitude, with respect, with firmness, and with grace. So here I'm going to do a reading. I made my partner sit down with me and pretend to be a sort of person who I was very much in disagreement with to practice this. So I'm going to read to you what I came up with these kinds of prompts. I'm so glad you came to me with your concern. You've been direct with me, and I'll be direct with you too. Decisions to prohibit hate symbols are made carefully and through an equity lens here. Often it's a student group or a group of students who have been seriously harmed who come forward and ask for this to happen. And I don't mean they just saw a Confederate flag. I mean they've been continuously harassed and bullied and threatened. And also, to be clear, Black Lives Matter is not currently on the table to be prohibited in our school or district, but I will be here for conversations with you and everyone in our school, district, community to find the best path forward. For me, that path has to be towards care for each other, not hate, for the sake of our students. And we will always prohibit violence and bullying, no matter the topic, even if it's between two individuals with no symbols involved at all. And I want to thank you for having a conversation with me. I need to end our time together now. I'd be happy to follow up with you by email, and I'd be happy to schedule another appointment. Okay, so these are all, we put a lot of things out there, but I know we haven't covered everything that you've experienced, everything that's coming up right now, and everything that you know. So I'm just going back to this quote about love, and I'm going to unshare though, because we're going to spend the next 15 minutes. We've made good time thanks to everybody unmuting quickly to be able to hear from you. So I'm going to stop this share. And I just want to ask you, what did we miss? What's coming up? What questions do you have? What stories do you have? What advice do you have? I think maybe heavy emphasis on the advice, because I know you all have done this time and time and time again. So yeah, let's jump right into this conversation and see where it takes us.
Do we have plans to use student voices in these narratives?
Carmen, do you want me to direct that question to you, or would you prefer me to answer it about having student voices included in narratives?
If you can answer that question. We haven't thought about that, Cynthia.
So I think that this training is more so about like the conversations that you get into, and I think that you can express the information that you've gotten from students, the conversations you've had with students, the things that have happened to students that you know about. I don't think that we're going to be providing like quotes from students in general, because we are trying to get specific here, like for the specific conversations. And in part, that's because there is some privacy happening around the students who initiated the conversation with the governor, in the sense that those students are sort of being protected so that, because we know that if they're not, that their privacy might they might get harassed, basically. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, or Carmen, you would like to add anything.
I have a question. This was great, by the way. Those are really great from my officer, from my position. But we're also really looking for ways, kind of when we talk about the lack of ability to have the time for that conversation, because we aren't all face to face right now. When we have parents that are interjecting negative comments that are in opposition of this movement into Zoom classrooms. Just some like sentence stems and frames to support our teachers in how to gracefully exit for the sake of the other kids in the room, and then kind of redirect. Like, we can handle the Zoom and figuring that part out, but we're trying to give them some words for to continue that conversation when their students have just witnessed that happen.
Yeah, it's like a very particular form of Zoom bombing. I'm wondering if anyone else has advice about that before I jump in. So in this case, my preference would be to hear from some teachers who have experienced this, and to hear about a little bit more about what they're saying, to kind of convey that real life experience on the ground of what has worked. And then the other thing I can do is sort of think about it and add that as like an extra slide among other things we discussed to the end of the talk, the end of this PowerPoint that will be distributed along with the training itself. I think that these scenarios are really, really tough. And when we're taking on this virtual environment and a parent is able to do that in a way they wouldn't be able to do in the classroom, we're in new territory that we haven't necessarily encountered before, and we're experimenting with that. So I think I'm very curious to hear other people's knowledge of any experimentation that has worked. And then we'll also follow up with some generated ideas for trying out some one-liners.
So Jennifer, this is Darren. This is second week of school for us. We've had that happen twice. One in the middle school, one in the high school. And both times, what I appreciated about my administrators was they had mentioned to their staff, if that were to happen, right, please acknowledge that the parent said something. Please quickly write down what they said. Explain to the parent in front of the kids, I need to move on and continue to teach my course. But would love to circle back with you and my administrator later this afternoon. So we do most of our secondary teaching in the morning, the online face-to-face, and office hours in the afternoons. And it allows for both of my administrators at the junior and senior high to have that. Both of those conversations went well. One was, for lack of a better term at least, a misunderstanding. I really actually believe it wasn't, but that's the way the parent characterized it once we confronted it professionally and clearly and in a timely manner. The other one was a little more extended, but fortunately for me, right, my high school principal, who happens to be the principal of the year, handles it really well. So, but we are confronting that in a very professional and quick way, mentioning that we need to move on with our teaching lesson because it's important and the time's important for all the students, but we're happy to get back to you. Can I get your name and number and move on?
I knew there'd be an answer in the group. Carmen, go ahead, jump in.
We've also had similar experiences. We created a form, it's called Something Just Happened. And we gave it to our teachers. So anytime there's a situation in class that happens, they fill that out. It comes to us right away. And then as an admin team, we can debrief. So we've had a couple situations that also went really well. And the teacher was able to reach out to the parent. And then we as an administrative team also reach out. We had one where a student was writing in there inappropriate things and said, I know this is a parent and a student, but the parent and said, all lives matter. And so that came to us and we were able to follow up with the parent and the student and have a really good conversation. And the kiddo, and it was a restorative conversation. And the kiddo was realized kind of like intent versus impact, because we use a form with them on that. And the kid on his own wrote a letter that he wanted to share with the class. And so he first shared it with us. And it was a very good letter about not understanding the impact and apologizing to the class. and it worked out really well. So, but we've also had a couple situations with parents, and it's gone well. And I can share the what just happened form if anybody wants it.
I think everybody wants it. So what else do you all know? What tactics do you use in tough conversations? One thing we haven't talked a lot about is a tough conversation with a teacher who might disagree, or a student or something like that. I'm also wondering, kind of going back to an original question of like, if you have had a tough conversation with a parent or a teacher or a student or someone else, and you were able to see a shift happening during that conversation, I'd love to hear more about how you were able to do that, if you would be willing to share.
For lack of time, right? It seems that when I've had the most difficult conversations with parents over the years as a principal or superintendent, the acknowledgement that they have taken the time to be there, and whether it's truly true or not, right? And say that I appreciate that you are here, because so many parents would not come, would not take the time. I appreciate and acknowledge the fact that you are here and that you are frustrated about whatever it is. And I try very hard to say, you know, I appreciate that you're here speaking your piece about whatever the issue is for your kids. When I acknowledge that, I have seen definite turns over the years. Not all the time, but a number of times where beyond the issue, what the parent really wanted was to be heard and acknowledged from somebody in the district. And when I say, I really appreciate that you care about your kid, and I know that you're here, and I know this is frustrating, is there any way for us to work together to make that happen? That generally works. As we all know, there's always exceptions, but that works.
Thank you. I hate taking up all the airtime, but so thank you. I also like to ask, I think a lot of times some of this is fear-based, and I like to ask, like, what are you afraid of? Like, not in a negative way, but like help kind of recognize like what our parents are afraid of, because a lot of times they're worried about their kids and, you know, what their kids aren't getting or are getting, or, you know, the divisiveness. So I think that also helps to kind of like have parents calm down. But I want to talk a little bit about the teacher issue, or the teacher perspective. So I had a teacher send out an all staff email that wanted to talk about SROs in our schools, because one of my other teachers had made a comment separately when the superintendent was talking about when are we getting SROs out of the building, right? And which was, you know, obviously not the appropriate time or space. That wasn't what we were talking about. So then my teacher in my building decides to send out an all school-wide email. You know, I just want to back up our SROs and this and that, and like just started talking. And I said, and I replied an email, and I said, I need this conversation to please stop. This is not the appropriate way to have a conversation behind a screen, and I don't want your colleagues of color to be injured through this. And then someone else we have a pretty big equity team. We have about 18 staff members. Someone from the equity team threw in a comment about why, you know, the systemic and their point. And then I replied in all capital letters, and I said, this is an administrative directive. This conversation needs to stop now, right? And then I had the union follow up with a letter that they sent out to the staff. When your administrator asks you to stop which I've never done, having a conversation professionally, you need to follow that. So then the next day I addressed my staff, and I said to them, you know, because that day I did end up having to call all my staff of color. I was getting text messages and things like that, and people were injured. Exactly what I was worried about. So I spent all day right before we're starting to start school, you know, all day making sure that people were okay, which is more important to me. So that's what I did. So I addressed the staff the next day and I said to them, you know, there's a few things that I'm concerned about. I said, one is I'm concerned about what this conversation is going to look like in the classroom with our students. Number two, whenever we have these types of conversations, it's really important that we set up norms and that it's facilitated in a way where people aren't going to be injured. And I said, I know that wasn't your intent, but that was your impact. So, and I told them, this is what I did yesterday. And I said, you never get to tell a Black and brown child what their experiences are. That's not happening. And I talked about equity not being political, right? That equity is a pillar that we go by. It's an educational pillar, not only within our school, but our district and at the state level. And you get to listen, you get to learn, and you get to grow from these students' experiences. And so what happened in the end was really cool. The person that threw out the email called me and he said, I never meant to hurt, you know. And I said, I know you didn't mean it, but that's what happened. But we can work through this. Like, I want to hear your voice. Your voice is really important to me. And that's how I lead anyway. So he sends out an email to the staff apologizing and, you know, talking about like how that was inappropriate. Then my equity leader, who leads a lot of the work, called me and said, I need to apologize. Right. And she said, you're my brown administrator, and I know that you really care about equity, but I still threw out another comment, even when you asked us to stop, because I'm a white woman and I have privilege. And I thought, well, Carmen doesn't mind, and I undermined you. So when we had our another equity training, because we do that at every staff meeting, she addressed the staff and apologized to the staff and to me about even her as an equity warrior throwing out a comment. And so there was a lot of learning that happened with everybody, and people still have their opinions, but, you know, we were able to turn it into like, how can we learn and grow from this and still have this conversation, just not the way that it was happening.
Yeah. Kimmy?
So I'll just go, I mean, I think this would work with parents and teachers is, I think it goes back to what a lot of you have said. People just want to be heard. And sometimes as administrators, we just got to take it, you know, because people are frustrated. They're coming from a place of hurt. And, you know, one thing that I do often is I say, all right, let's figure this out together. We want the same thing. We want your child to be successful, and let's figure this out. And I find that that has worked quite well because it's true. I mean, we all want the best for their child. Sometimes, you know, we're even trying to protect that child from themselves, you know, and so I think that has worked really well.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end. I think that one powerful phrase, right, let's figure it out together, is something to carry in your back pocket too. I've learned so much from all of you on this call. I'm so grateful. And as much as I enjoy putting together a presentation with some tips and ideas and, you know, talking points that we could make personal, I think the real quality of our conversation together today was your stories. So I hope that other people can benefit from them too, and that this community of community of practice around challenging conversations can continue, because I think we're all going to benefit from that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you again.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for taking the time and participating.